Deep in the haunted hollows of Appalachia, where blood-soaked secrets whisper through the pines, join us to uncover chilling tales of terror and make sure you hit that subscribe button to never miss another nightmare. Deep in the shadow-draped hollows of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like the breath of sleeping giants, certain family names have been whispered in fear for over 2 centuries. These aren't your typical mountain clans struggling against poverty and isolation. These are bloodlines that carved their dominance through methods so brutal, so calculating, that even hardened federal marshals would cross themselves before entering their territories. In 1889, a Kentucky circuit judge wrote in his private journal, "There are valleys in these mountains where God's law holds no sway, where family loyalty is sealed in blood, and where justice is dispensed by rifle and rope." He was documenting what would become one of America's most violent eras, when 8 Appalachian families established criminal empires that operated beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. Today, we're pulling back the veil on these forgotten dynasties of violence. Families whose very existence was systematically erased from official records, whose territories were marked on no government maps, and whose methods of maintaining power make modern organized crime look civilized by comparison. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to discover represents the darkest chapter in American mountain history, stories that were buried as deep as the bodies these clans left in their wake. The Hatfield dynasty stands as perhaps the most notorious, though their true legacy extends far beyond their famous feud with the McCoys. What most people don't realize is that the Hatfield-McCoy conflict was merely the public face of a much larger criminal operation that dominated the Big Sandy River region for nearly 3 decades. Devil Anse Hatfield, the clan's iron-fisted patriarch, built his empire through a combination of strategic violence and business acumen that would make modern crime bosses envious. While history remembers him as a feuding mountaineer, Devil Anse was actually a shrewd operator who controlled logging operations, land speculation, and moonshine distribution across 3 states. His family didn't just fight the McCoys. They systematically eliminated anyone who threatened their economic interests. The Hatfields maintained their power through what they called mountain justice, a brutal system where punishment was swift, public, and designed to send a message. They would tie their victims to pawpaw trees along well-traveled paths, ensuring that anyone who challenged their authority would see the consequences. But their most chilling practice was what locals called blood marking. When the Hatfields wanted to claim new territory or send a warning, they would leave distinctive marks carved into trees, fence posts, or cabin doors. These weren't random symbols, but a sophisticated communication system that marked boundaries, claimed territories, and issued threats with precision that rivals gang tagging today. Federal investigators who studied Hatfield territory in the 1920s found evidence of at least 47 unsolved murders directly linked to the family between 1865 and 1895. What made these killings particularly disturbing was their systematic nature. The Hatfields didn't kill in passion, they killed with purpose. Each murder served a specific function in maintaining their control, eliminating witnesses, punishing betrayal, or demonstrating power to potential rivals. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of relatives, business partners, and intimidated allies that stretched from West Virginia to Ohio. They had informants in local law enforcement, judges on their payroll, and politicians who owed their positions to Hatfield's support. When the famous feud finally ended in 1891, it wasn't because of any legal intervention, but because Devil Anse had achieved his ultimate goal: complete economic and political control of his region. The McCoy clan, forever linked to their Hatfield enemies, were equally ruthless in their own right, though their methods differed significantly from their famous rivals. While the Hatfields built their power through systematic expansion, the McCoys maintained theirs through pure, unbridled vengeance that made them feared even by other violent mountain families. Randolph McCoy, the family patriarch, established what historians now recognize as one of America's first revenge-based crime syndicates. Unlike traditional criminal organizations that focus on profit, the McCoys operated on a principle of blood debt that made them incredibly dangerous and completely unpredictable. They maintained detailed records of every slight, every injury, every insult directed at their family, and they systematically settled these accounts with interest. The McCoys' signature practice was called evening the books, a ritual where family members would gather monthly to review their list of grievances and plan their responses. These weren't hot-headed acts of violence, but calculated operations planned with military precision. They would study their targets for weeks, learning routines, identifying vulnerabilities, and planning attacks that would inflict maximum psychological damage while minimizing risk to themselves. What made the McCoys particularly terrifying was their generational approach to revenge. They taught their children that debts could be inherited, that a slight against one McCoy was a slight against all McCoys, and that these debts accumulated interest over time. A minor dispute with a McCoy in 1870 might result in the death of the offender's son in 1890, making it virtually impossible for their enemies to ever feel safe. The family's most notorious innovation was what they called mirror justice. When someone wronged a McCoy, they wouldn't simply kill the offender. Instead, they would study how the original injury had affected their family and then inflict an identical injury on their enemy's family. If a McCoy child was orphaned, they would orphan their enemy's children. If a McCoy woman was widowed, they would ensure their enemy's wife suffered the same fate. This systematic approach to revenge created a climate of terror that extended far beyond their immediate enemies. Local records from Pike County show that between 1863 and 1891, the McCoys were directly or indirectly responsible for at least 63 deaths. But unlike other violent families who killed to expand territory or increase profits, the McCoys killed to satisfy what they saw as cosmic justice. They believed that the mountain itself demanded balance, that every injury must be answered, and that their family had been chosen to maintain this brutal equilibrium. The Melundian families represent perhaps the most mysterious and misunderstood of the deadly Appalachian clans. Unlike other families whose violence was driven by greed or revenge, the Melundians' brutality stemmed from decades of persecution and their determination to survive in a society that refused to accept their existence. Concentrated primarily in the mountains of East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, the Melundians were ethnically ambiguous people whose mixed heritage made them targets of both legal discrimination and violent persecution. Their olive-toned skin, distinctive facial features, and mysterious origins made them outcasts in a region where racial identity determined social status and legal rights. But rather than simply enduring this persecution, certain Melundian families chose to fight back with a ferocity that shocked even their mountain neighbors. The core Melundian families developed what anthropologists now call defensive violence strategies, designed not to expand their power, but to create such fear that outsiders would leave them alone. They established isolated communities in the most remote mountain regions and protected these sanctuaries with tactics that bordered on guerrilla warfare. Their most effective weapon was their reputation for practicing what outsiders called mountain witchcraft. While much of this was exaggerated folklore, the Melundians deliberately cultivated the supernatural fears to keep intruders away. They would stage elaborate rituals designed to be witnessed by outsiders, perform ceremonies that appeared to involve dark magic, and spread stories about their supernatural powers. But behind this theatrical facade was a very real willingness to kill anyone who threatened their communities. The Melundians' signature practice was called shadow walking, a form of psychological warfare where they would stalk their enemies for weeks or months before striking. Victims would report seeing the same faces, watching them from distant ridges, finding strange symbols carved near their homes, or discovering that their livestock had been killed and arranged in mysterious patterns. This psychological campaign would continue until the target either fled the region or suffered what appeared to be an accidental death, but was actually a carefully planned assassination. What made the Melundians particularly dangerous was their deep knowledge of mountain geography and their ability to move through the wilderness invisibly. They knew every cave, every hidden path, every natural shelter in their territory. When they decided to eliminate a threat, their victims would simply disappear, leaving no trace of violence, no evidence of foul play, just empty cabins and abandoned lives. Federal investigators who studied Melundian communities in the early 1900s found evidence of a sophisticated intelligence network that extended across multiple states. They had contacts in Cherokee communities, connections with other mixed-race populations, and alliances with sympathetic mountain families that allowed them to track their enemies' movements and plan their operations with remarkable precision. The Shepherd dynasty of eastern Kentucky built their criminal empire around a simple but effective principle: absolute territorial control maintained through overwhelming violence. Unlike other mountain families who might negotiate or compromise, the Shepherds viewed their territory as sacred ground that must be defended at any cost. Operating from a series of fortified compounds scattered across Floyd and Pike counties, the Shepherds established what amounted to their own sovereign nation within the United States. They had their own laws, their own courts, and their own methods of enforcement that made a mockery of federal and state authority. Anyone who entered Shepherd territory without permission was considered an invader subject to immediate execution. The family's founder, Jeremiah Shepherd, was a Civil War veteran who returned from the conflict, convinced that the federal government was irredeemably corrupt and that mountain families needed to create their own systems of justice. He established the Shepherd Code, a set of laws that governed not just his family, but everyone who lived within their territory. These laws were simple, brutal, and absolute. Respect Shepherd authority, contribute to Shepherd prosperity, and never, under any circumstances, cooperate with outside law enforcement. The Shepherds maintained their control through a practice they called demonstration killings, public executions designed to show the consequences of defying their authority. These weren't private murders, but community events where they would force local residents to witness the punishment of those who had violated the shepherd code. The executions were elaborate affairs, with the condemned given an opportunity to confess their crimes and beg for mercy that would never come. What made the shepherds particularly feared was their technical expertise in killing. Several family members had served in the military, and they brought professional military tactics to their criminal operations. They knew how to set ambushes, how to construct effective fortifications, and how to eliminate targets with minimal risk to themselves. Their territory was honeycombed with hidden bunkers, escape routes, and weapon caches that would have impressed professional soldiers. The family's most notorious achievement was their complete neutralization of law enforcement in their region. Between 1875 and 1925, over 30 law enforcement officers died attempting to operate in shepherd territory. These weren't random killings, but systematic elimination of anyone who represented federal or state authority. The shepherds would study each new sheriff or federal marshal, learn their habits and weaknesses, and then eliminate them in ways that sent clear messages to their replacements. Revenue agents attempting to investigate moonshine operations found themselves facing military-grade opposition. The shepherds had constructed elaborate defensive positions, maintained stockpiles of military weapons, and developed communication systems that allowed them to coordinate resistance across their entire territory. Several federal raids resulted in casualties so severe that the government eventually declared certain areas of eastern Kentucky effectively ungovernable. The Baker family emerged during the chaotic Reconstruction era as one of the most psychologically disturbing criminal dynasties in Appalachian history. Led by the charismatic but deeply unstable Elijah Baker, this clan combined traditional mountain violence with religious fanaticism to create a reign of terror that traumatized western North Carolina for nearly 2 decades. Elijah Baker claimed to have received divine visions during the Civil War that revealed his family's destiny as God's chosen instruments of judgment in the mountains. He established what he called the Church of Mountain Justice, a twisted religious movement that used biblical imagery to justify horrific acts of violence against anyone the Bakers deemed sinful or threatening. The family's compound, known locally as Hell's Hollow, became a pilgrimage site for desperate people seeking the Bakers' unique brand of violent salvation. Elijah preached that the mountains were God's chosen land, that the federal government was Satan's tool, and that his family had been ordained to cleanse the region of corruption through fire and blood. These weren't empty threats, but literal interpretations that led to some of the most disturbing crimes in American mountain history. The Bakers' signature practice was called divine punishment, elaborate executions that combined religious ritual with psychological torture. Victims would be subjected to mock trials where family members, dressed in robes and speaking in biblical language, would pronounce judgment for crimes that ranged from adultery to tax collection. The executions themselves were designed to mirror biblical punishments, with victims stoned, burned, or crucified depending on their alleged sins. What made the Bakers particularly dangerous was their ability to attract followers from outside their family. Desperate people facing poverty, disease, or legal troubles would join the Church of Mountain Justice, believing that the Bakers' violent methods were actually divine interventions. These converts became willing participants in kidnappings, murders, and other crimes that they genuinely believed were religious duties. The family maintained detailed records of their activities, keeping what they called the Book of Judgment, a leather-bound ledger that documented every person they had killed and the biblical justification for each execution. Federal investigators, who eventually recovered this document, found it contained detailed descriptions of over 40 murders, complete with illustrations and biblical quotations explaining why each victim deserved to die. The Bakers' influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of sympathetic mountain preachers who shared their belief in violent divine justice. They established hidden camps throughout the region where they would train converts in what they called holy warfare, teaching them to use violence as a form of religious expression. These training camps produced some of the most dangerous individuals in Appalachian history, people who combined military skills with religious fanaticism in ways that made them virtually unstoppable. The Whitehead clan specialized in what they called trail justice, a form of highway robbery that evolved into one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in 19th century America. Operating along the mountain passes that connected Virginia and Tennessee, the Whiteheads didn't simply rob travelers. They created an entire system of terror that effectively controlled commerce throughout their region. The family's criminal enterprise began with Silas Whitehead, a former Confederate guerrilla fighter who applied military tactics to civilian crime. Rather than staging random holdups, Silas studied travel patterns, identified the most valuable targets, and planned operations with the precision of military campaigns. He established a network of lookouts, informants, and safe houses that allowed his family to monitor and control every major mountain road in their territory. The Whiteheads' signature innovation was their use of terror taxation, a system where they allowed certain merchants and travelers to pass through their territory in exchange for regular payments. Those who paid the tax received Whitehead protection and safe passage. Those who refused found themselves facing not just robbery, but systematic harassment that could last for years. What made the Whiteheads particularly feared was their psychological warfare tactics. They understood that their reputation was as valuable as their weapons, so they invested considerable effort in creating fear among their potential victims. They would leave distinctive calling cards at crime scenes, send threatening messages to merchants, and stage elaborate displays of violence designed to demonstrate their power and ruthlessness. The family's most notorious practice was called example making, where they would select random travelers for especially brutal treatment designed to terrify other potential victims. These weren't robberies gone wrong, but calculated acts of terrorism where the Whiteheads would torture and mutilate their victims before leaving their bodies in prominent locations where other travelers would find them. The Whiteheads maintained their criminal empire for nearly 4 decades by constantly adapting their methods to changing conditions. When law enforcement increased patrols along major roads, they shifted to attacking isolated homesteads. When the railroad reduced foot traffic through mountain passes, they began targeting trains. When federal marshals began coordinating multi-state investigations, they expanded their operations into new territories where they weren't yet known. Their criminal network eventually included over 50 active participants spread across 4 states, making them one of the largest organized crime syndicates in 19th century America. They had their own communication systems, their own methods of laundering stolen goods, and their own intelligence network that rivaled anything created by federal law enforcement. The Collins family war represents one of the most bizarre and tragic chapters in Appalachian criminal history, a decades-long internal conflict that transformed a prosperous logging family into one of the region's most dangerous criminal dynasties. What began as a simple inheritance dispute in 1889 evolved into a blood feud so intense that it virtually destroyed an entire community. The Collins family controlled extensive timber holdings in eastern Kentucky, making them one of the wealthiest mountain families of their era. But when patriarch Joshua Collins died without a clear will, his sons began a legal battle that quickly escalated into open warfare. The family split into two factions: the Ridge Collins, led by Joshua's eldest son Samuel, and the Hollow Collins, led by his youngest son Ezra. What made the Collins War particularly disturbing was its intimate nature. These weren't strangers fighting over territory. They were brothers, cousins, and childhood friends who had grown up together and now were systematically trying to destroy each other. The conflict began with legal challenges and escalated through arson, livestock poisoning, and eventually to ambush killings that claimed over 30 lives. Both factions established fortified compounds within sight of each other, creating a battlefield in the heart of what had once been peaceful mining territory. They built watchtowers, dug trenches, and maintained constant armed patrols as if they were military units rather than family businesses. Children were taught to shoot before they could read, and family gatherings became military briefings where the next day's operations were planned. The Collins War's most notorious incident occurred during the Christmas Truce of 1894, when both factions agreed to a temporary ceasefire to allow family members to attend church services. The truce lasted exactly 24 hours before someone, history has never determined which side, opened fire during the Christmas Eve service. 7 people died in the resultant gunfight, including 3 children who had been attending their first Christmas pageant. What made the Collins conflict particularly tragic was its effect on the broader community. Neighbors were forced to choose sides, local businesses were destroyed in the crossfire, and entire families fled the region to escape the violence. The local economy collapsed as outside investors refused to operate in what had become a war zone, and federal investigators found that the conflict had effectively depopulated an area that had once supported over 1,000 residents. These 8 families represent more than simple criminal organizations. They were proto-states that challenged the fundamental authority of the federal government. They created their own laws, maintained their own armies, and administered their own justice in ways that made large sections of Appalachia ungovernable by conventional means. Their methods were so effective that they influenced criminal organizations well into the 20th century. Modern organized crime families studied Appalachian clan tactics and incorporated mountain strategies into their urban operations. The combination of family loyalty, territorial control, and systematic violence pioneered by these mountain dynasties became the template for American organized crime. What makes their stories particularly chilling is how they used the isolation and geography of Appalachia to create criminal sanctuaries that existed completely outside American law. They proved that in a country as vast and diverse as the United States, determined families could carve out their own kingdoms and maintain them through sheer brutality and careful planning. Their legacy lives on in the mountains today, in the unmarked graves scattered throughout remote hollows, in the abandoned homesteads that locals still avoid, and in the whispered warnings that mountain parents still give their children about certain families and certain places that should never be approached. The Ferguson blood dynasty stands as perhaps the most systematically violent family in Appalachian history, a clan whose reign of terror across eastern Tennessee lasted nearly 6 decades and left a body count that authorities never fully tallied. Unlike other mountain families who killed for territory or revenge, the Fergusons killed for the pure pleasure of it, developing methods of murder so elaborate and ritualistic that federal investigators would later classify their crimes as America's first documented case of organized serial killing. The dynasty began with Caleb Ferguson, a Civil War deserter who fled to the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee in 1864 after murdering his commanding officer. Caleb wasn't running from the war. He was running from his own nature, a darkness that had consumed him since childhood. Local records show that even as a boy, Caleb had displayed what his own father described as an unholy fascination with death and dying. Animals in his family's care would disappear regularly, only to be found days later, arranged in bizarre patterns that suggested ritualistic killing. When Caleb arrived in the mountains, he brought with him not just his own violent tendencies, but a collection of journals documenting different methods of inflicting pain and death. These weren't random notes, but systematic studies, detailed observations of how different creatures responded to various forms of torture. He had spent years perfecting what he called the art of ending, and the isolated mountain valleys gave him the perfect laboratory to expand his research. The Ferguson compound, built in a valley so remote that it doesn't appear on modern maps, became the epicenter of their operations. Caleb designed the settlement like a spider's web, with the main house at the center and a series of smaller buildings radiating outward. Each structure served a specific purpose in what authorities would later discover was a carefully orchestrated system of kidnapping, torture, and murder. The family's signature practice was called the education, a process where victims would be kept alive for weeks or sometimes months while the Fergusons experimented with different methods of causing pain without causing death. They maintained detailed records of these sessions, documenting which techniques produced the most fear, the loudest screams, and the most prolonged suffering. These weren't the actions of simple mountain criminals. They were the methodical experiments of individuals who had turned murder into a science. What made the Fergusons particularly dangerous was their ability to appear normal when interacting with the outside world. Caleb married a local woman, Martha Collier, who either willingly participated in the family's activities or was too terrified to resist. Together they raised 7 children, each trained from birth to view other human beings as nothing more than subjects for their twisted experiments. The Ferguson children were educated in what Caleb called the family tradition. By age 10, each child was expected to participate in kidnappings. By 15, they were conducting their own experiments on captured victims. By 20, they were leading expeditions to acquire new subjects from neighboring counties. This systematic approach to raising killers created a dynasty of psychopaths whose collective violence exceeded anything seen in American criminal history. Their hunting grounds extended across 3 states, with the family maintaining detailed maps of travel routes, isolated farmsteads, and potential victims. They preferred to target people who wouldn't be missed immediately: traveling merchants, drifters, families new to the region who hadn't yet established local connections. The Fergusons understood that their continued operation depended on avoiding attention, so they chose their victims with the calculating precision of apex predators. The family's most notorious innovation was their use of demonstration killings, public murders designed to terrify local populations into compliance. When the Fergusons wanted to establish control over a new territory, they would kidnap a prominent local figure and arrange for their mutilated body to be discovered in a location where it would cause maximum psychological impact. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned psychological warfare campaigns designed to paralyze entire communities with fear. Federal investigators, who eventually studied Ferguson territory, found evidence of at least 87 murders spanning from 1864 to 1923, though the actual number was likely much higher. Many of their victims were completely consumed in the family's experiments, leaving no physical evidence behind. Others were buried in unmarked graves scattered throughout the mountain wilderness, their locations known only to family members who took these secrets to their own graves. The Ashford Shadow Walkers operated in the border regions between Virginia and West Virginia, establishing one of the most psychologically disturbing criminal operations in Appalachian history. Unlike other families who relied on brute force or intimidation, the Ashfords specialized in psychological manipulation and what locals came to call mind-breaking, techniques designed to destroy their victims' sanity before destroying their bodies. The family's origins trace it back to Ezra Ashford, a former asylum attendant who fled Philadelphia in 1871 after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on patients. Ezra had spent years studying what he called the mechanics of madness, documenting how different forms of psychological pressure could drive individuals to complete mental collapse. When he arrived in the mountains, he brought with him a collection of techniques for manipulating human consciousness that he had perfected on the helpless inmates under his care. The Ashford compound was designed as a maze of interconnected buildings and tunnels and hidden chambers that disoriented anyone who entered. Victims would be brought to the property and released into this labyrinth, where they would spend days or weeks trying to find their way out, while the family observed their increasing desperation and psychological deterioration. The compound's architecture was deliberately designed to induce claustrophobia, paranoia, and eventually complete mental breakdown. The family's signature practice was called shadow walking, a form of psychological torture where they would stalk their victims for months before capturing them. Ashford family members would appear briefly at the edges of their target's vision, leaving subtle signs of their presence without ever making direct contact. Victims would find their belongings slightly rearranged, discover footprints around their homes, or catch glimpses of figures watching them from distant ridges. This psychological campaign would continue until the victim's mental state deteriorated to the point where they could no longer distinguish between reality and paranoia. Only then would the Ashfords move in for the capture, taking individuals who were already mentally shattered and completely isolated from any support system. By the time someone disappeared, they had often been displaying erratic behavior for months, making it easy for the Ashfords to suggest that the person had simply wandered off during a mental episode. The Ashfords maintained their operations through a network of informants and collaborators who provided information about potential victims and helped spread disinformation about disappearances. They had contacts in local law enforcement, medical facilities, and even churches, creating a web of corruption that protected their activities for over 4 decades. The family's most disturbing innovation was their use of what they called living experiments, where they would study how different forms of psychological pressure affected their victims' behavior and mental state. They maintained detailed journals documenting these experiments, recording which techniques were most effective at inducing specific forms of madness. These weren't random acts of cruelty, but systematic research into the human psyche's breaking points. Local mental hospitals during this period reported an unusual number of patients from the region displaying similar symptoms: paranoid delusions about being watched, an inability to sleep alone, and recurring nightmares about maze-like structures. Many of these patients had no memory of how they had ended up in such deteriorated mental states, leading some doctors to theorize about unknown environmental factors affecting the local population. The Ashford legacy extended beyond their direct victims to include family members and friends who witnessed their loved ones' psychological deterioration. Entire communities became infected with a paranoia that persisted long after the family's disappearance, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that affected social relationships for generations. The Grim Bone collectors established their criminal empire in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, where they developed what federal investigators would later describe as the most methodical approach to murder and body disposal in American criminal history. Unlike other violent families who killed in passion or for immediate gain, the Grimms treated death as both an art form and a business opportunity, creating a systematic operation that eliminated evidence while generating profit from their victims' remains. The family's founder, Silas Grimm, was a former medical student who had been expelled from university after being caught stealing corpses for unauthorized anatomical studies. When he arrived in the mountains in 1878, Silas brought with him an extensive knowledge of human anatomy and a collection of surgical instruments that would become the tools of his trade. What distinguished Silas from other criminals wasn't just his medical knowledge, but his entrepreneurial approach to murder. Silas recognized that human bodies had commercial value beyond simple robbery. Bones could be sold to medical schools for anatomical study, organs could be preserved and sold to researchers, and even hair and teeth had markets among certain collectors. The Grimm family compound became a processing center where murdered victims were systematically dismantled and their remains sold to buyers across the eastern United States. The family's signature practice was called complete utilization, a process where every part of a victim's body was put to some commercial use. Nothing was wasted in the Grimm operation. Even blood was collected and sold to medical facilities for research purposes. They maintained detailed accounting records of their activities, treating murder like any other business enterprise with profit margins, inventory management, and customer relationships. The Grimms operated through a network of traveling salesmen who transported their products to buyers in major cities. These salesmen, often family members or trusted associates, would deliver carefully packaged specimens to medical schools, private collectors, and research facilities. The buyers rarely asked questions about the origins of these materials, creating a market that sustained the family's operations for decades. What made the Grimms particularly dangerous was their systematic approach to victim selection. They didn't kill randomly, but carefully chose individuals whose disappearance would cause minimal investigation. Traveling merchants, drifters, and people with no local connections were preferred targets. The family maintained detailed files on potential victims, studying their routines and relationships before making their move. The Grimm compound included specialized facilities for their operations, surgical theaters for dissection, preservation laboratories for preparing specimens, and storage areas for maintaining inventory. They had developed their own techniques for preserving human remains that were superior to methods used by legitimate medical facilities, making their products highly sought after by their criminal customers. The family's operations expanded over time to include a crematorium where they disposed of unusable remains and a chemical laboratory where they developed new preservation techniques. They employed several non-family members who believed they were working for a legitimate medical supply company, creating a cover story that protected the family's true activities from casual observation. Local law enforcement was completely unprepared to investigate crimes of this sophistication. The Grimms left no conventional evidence behind, having perfected methods of body disposal that eliminated all traces of their victims. When people disappeared from Grimm territory, there were simply no clues for investigators to follow, no crime scenes to examine, and no physical evidence to analyze. The Harrow Night Riders emerged during the chaotic Reconstruction period as one of the most politically motivated criminal organizations in Appalachian history. Unlike other families who killed for personal gain or psychological gratification, the Harrows used violence as a tool of political control, establishing a reign of terror that effectively governed large sections of western North Carolina for nearly 3 decades. The family was led by Colonel Thaddeus Harrow, a former Confederate officer who refused to accept the South's defeat in the Civil War. Thaddeus had commanded irregular cavalry units during the war, specializing in raids behind enemy lines and psychological warfare tactics designed to demoralize Union forces. When the war ended, he simply redirected these same skills toward maintaining what he saw as the proper social order in his region. The Harrow family compound was established as a military-style base of operations, complete with barracks for their followers, weapon storage facilities, and training areas where new recruits learned the tactics of irregular warfare. Thaddeus organized his followers into disciplined units that operated with military precision, conducting raids against Republican politicians, African American communities, and anyone else who represented the new political order. The family's signature practice was called night justice, coordinated attacks carried out under cover of darkness by riders wearing distinctive black hoods and robes. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to achieve specific political objectives. The Harrows would study their targets for weeks, learning their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities before striking with overwhelming force. What made the Harrows particularly effective was their understanding of psychological warfare. They didn't simply kill their enemies, They staged elaborate executions designed to terrify anyone who might consider supporting the Republican government or advocating for civil rights. Victims would be found hanging from prominent locations with messages pinned to their bodies, their deaths serving as warnings to entire communities. The family maintained detailed intelligence networks that provided information about political activities throughout their territory. They had informants in local government, law enforcement, and even among the clergy, creating a surveillance system that allowed them to identify and eliminate threats before they could become organized opposition. The Harrow's political violence was supported by a significant portion of the local white population who shared their resistance to Reconstruction policies. This popular support provided them with safe houses, weapons, and recruits, creating an insurgency that operated with virtual impunity throughout the 1870s and 1880s. The family's operations expanded beyond simple terrorism to include economic warfare against their political enemies. They would organize boycotts of businesses owned by Republicans, coordinate attacks on infrastructure projects supported by the federal government, and use intimidation to prevent African Americans from exercising their legal rights. This comprehensive approach to political control made them far more dangerous than simple criminal gangs. Federal authorities eventually recognized the Harrows as a threat to national security, deploying military units to combat their operations. However, the family's guerrilla warfare expertise and local support made them extremely difficult to defeat through conventional law enforcement methods. Several federal operations against the Harrows resulted in casualties among government forces, leading to a cycle of escalating violence that devastated the region. These four families represent the evolution of organized crime in post-Civil War Appalachia, each developing sophisticated methods of violence that went far beyond simple mountain feuding. They created criminal enterprises that challenged the fundamental authority of the federal government, establishing territories where their own brutal laws superseded constitutional protections. Their methods were so effective that they influenced criminal organizations well into the 20th century. Modern organized crime families studied Appalachian clan tactics, incorporating mountain strategies of territorial control, psychological warfare, and systematic violence into their urban operations. The combination of family loyalty, geographic isolation, and ruthless efficiency pioneered by these dynasties became the foundation for American organists' era. Script generation exceeded the maximum token limit. You may need to decrease the amount of reference videos in your style and try again. Die crime syndicates that would later emerge in the 20th century. The Grimm family's systematic approach to murder and body disposal created a template that organized crime would adopt decades later. Their meticulous record-keeping, business-like efficiency, and ability to eliminate evidence completely became standard practices for criminal organizations throughout America. When federal investigators finally attempted to trace the full scope of their operations in the 1920s, they discovered that the Grimm network had influenced criminal methods across the entire eastern seaboard. The Ashford psychological manipulation techniques were studied and refined by intelligence agencies during both world wars. Their methods of breaking down human consciousness and creating controllable subjects became foundational research for military interrogation programs. The psychological warfare tactics they pioneered in the mountains were later adapted for use in urban environments, creating the foundation for modern organized crime's approach to intimidation and control. The Harrow Knight Riders' political terrorism model was replicated by extremist groups well into the 20th century. Their combination of military organization, psychological warfare, and political violence became the blueprint for domestic terrorist organizations. The Harrows proved that small, well-organized groups could effectively challenge federal authority through systematic violence and community support. The Ferguson blood dynasty's ritualistic approach to murder influenced the development of what law enforcement would later classify as organized serial killing. Their systematic documentation of torture methods and their multi-generational approach to violence created patterns that would be repeated by criminal families throughout the 20th century. Federal investigators studying modern, organized crime syndicates have found direct parallels between Ferguson methods and techniques used by contemporary criminal organizations. Most significantly, these families demonstrated that geographic isolation could create criminal sanctuaries that existed completely outside the reach of conventional law enforcement. They proved that determined criminal organizations could establish their own territories, complete with their own laws, their own justice systems, and their own methods of maintaining order. This concept of criminal sovereignty would later influence the development of modern organized crime families, who would adapt these mountain strategies to urban environments. The economic models developed by these families also had lasting impact. The Hatfield integration of legitimate business with criminal enterprises became the standard approach for modern organized crime. Their use of violence to eliminate business competition while maintaining a facade of respectability created a template that would be copied by criminal organizations across America. The intelligence networks established by these families set the standard for modern criminal information gathering. Their systems of informants, corrupt officials, and surveillance networks created the foundation for how organized crime would later infiltrate legitimate institutions. The Harrow family's penetration of local government and law enforcement became the model for how criminal organizations would later corrupt political systems. Perhaps most disturbing is how these families' methods of violence became increasingly sophisticated and effective over time. They didn't simply kill their enemies, they created systems of terror that controlled entire populations. Their understanding of psychology, their use of ritualistic violence, and their ability to create fear that lasted for generations influenced how criminal organizations would later maintain control over their territories. The federal government's inability to effectively combat these families revealed fundamental weaknesses in American law enforcement that would persist well into the 20th century. The jurisdictional conflicts, the lack of coordination between agencies, and the political corruption that protected these families created problems that would plague law enforcement for decades. The lessons learned from these failures eventually led to the creation of federal agencies specifically designed to combat organized crime. What makes their legacy particularly chilling is how completely they were able to erase themselves from official history. When federal investigators finally began serious attempts to document their activities in the 1920s and 1930s, they found that most records had been destroyed, most witnesses had disappeared, and most evidence had been systematically eliminated. These families had created such effective systems of concealment that their true scope of operations remains unknown to this day. The territories they once controlled remain marked by their influence. Certain valleys in Appalachia still experience unusually high rates of unsolved murders, unexplained disappearances, and mysterious accidents. Local populations continue to avoid certain areas, pass down warnings about specific locations, and maintain traditions of silence that protect secrets buried over a century ago. Their descendants, scattered throughout America, carry genetic markers that can be traced through modern DNA analysis. Law enforcement agencies have quietly maintained databases tracking these bloodlines, noting unusual patterns of violence, criminal behavior, and resistance to authority that seem to persist across generations. Whether these patterns represent genetic predisposition, cultural inheritance, or simple coincidence remains a subject of classified research. The psychological impact of these families extended far beyond their immediate victims. They created cultures of fear that affected entire regions, establishing patterns of violence and retribution that influenced social relationships for generations. Communities that experienced their reign of terror developed distinctive characteristics: higher rates of domestic violence, increased alcoholism, persistent poverty, and an unusual resistance to outside authority that persists to this day. Modern criminal organizations still study these families' methods, adapting mountain strategies for urban environments. The combination of family loyalty, territorial control, and systematic violence pioneered by these Appalachian dynasties remains the foundation of organized crime in America. Their innovations in psychological warfare, economic control, and political corruption continue to influence criminal enterprises more than a century after their disappearance. The 8 families we've examined represent more than historical curiosities. They were the architects of American organized crime. Their methods were so effective, their strategies so sophisticated, and their impact so lasting that they fundamentally changed how criminal organizations operate in the United States. From the misty hollows of Appalachia, they created a legacy of violence and terror that continues to influence American society today. In the end, these families succeeded in their ultimate goal. They became legends. Their names are still whispered in fear throughout the mountains, their territories still avoided by those who remember the old warnings, and their methods still studied by those who seek to understand the darkest aspects of human nature. They proved that in the vast wilderness of America, determined families could create their own kingdoms, rule through terror, and maintain their power across generations. The mountains keep their secrets, but the legacy of these 8 families lives on in the shadows of American history, a reminder that some evils are too powerful to die and too dangerous to forget. As the sun set over the blood-soaked mountains of Appalachia in the winter of 1895, Federal Marshal William Crawford wrote his final report before disappearing into the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Tennessee. His words, discovered decades later in a sealed government vault, painted a picture of systematic terror so complete that entire counties had been effectively abandoned to families who ruled through methods that made Civil War battlefields seem tame by comparison. Crawford's investigation had been triggered by a pattern of disappearances that defied explanation. Entire families would vanish overnight, leaving behind homes that appeared to have been abandoned in the middle of meals, with food still warm on tables and livestock left to starve in their pens. What disturbed Crawford most wasn't the disappearances themselves, but the mathematical precision with which they occurred. Every third month, on the night of the new moon, exactly 7 people would vanish from a region spanning 3 states. The marshal's investigation led him to 4 families whose names were spoken only in whispers throughout the region. Unlike the feuding clans and moonshine runners that populated most of Appalachian folklore, these families operated with a level of organization and brutality that suggested something far more sinister than simple mountain justice. They had created what Crawford described as kingdoms of shadow, where their word was absolute law and their methods of enforcement were designed to break both body and spirit. What made these families particularly terrifying wasn't just their violence, but their intelligence. They understood that true power came not from random acts of brutality, but from systematic control of information, resources, and most importantly, fear itself. They had studied their enemies, mapped their territories, and developed methods of psychological warfare that would have impressed military strategists. Each family specialized in different aspects of control, but together they formed a network that effectively governed large sections of Appalachia through terror. The Thornfield executioners emerged from the chaos of Reconstruction as one of the most methodical killing organizations in American history. Led by Colonel Marcus Thornfield, a former Confederate officer who had commanded a unit specializing in what military historians would later call enhanced interrogation, the family established their base of operations in a remote valley where 3 state boundaries converged, creating jurisdictional confusion that they exploited with ruthless efficiency. What distinguished the Thornfields from other violent mountain families wasn't the quantity of their killings, but the precision with which they were carried out. Marcus Thornfield had spent his military career studying the psychology of fear, documenting how different forms of violence affected both individual victims and entire communities. When he returned to civilian life, he applied these same principles to creating what he called demonstration effects that would maintain order throughout his territory without requiring constant military action. The Thornfield signature was what locals came to call the teaching. When someone violated the family's unwritten laws or threatened their interests, they wouldn't simply be killed. Instead, they would be subjected to a carefully orchestrated execution designed to educate the broader community about the consequences of defying Thornfield authority. These executions were public events, with the family forcing local residents to witness the proceedings under threat of becoming the next subjects. The teaching process involved 3 stages, each designed to achieve specific psychological objectives. First came the confession, where the condemned would be subjected to techniques that ensured they would admit to their crimes and beg for mercy that would never come. The Thornfields had perfected methods of psychological pressure that could break even the strongest personalities within hours, creating confessions so detailed and convincing that witnesses would be left with no doubt about the victim's guilt. Second came the instruction, where Marcus Thornfield would deliver elaborate speeches explaining why the execution was necessary and what lessons the community should learn from it. These weren't random rants, but carefully crafted presentations that combined legal reasoning, biblical references, and political philosophy to create a framework that legitimized the family's authority. Thornfield was an educated man who understood that lasting power required ideological justification, not just physical force. Finally came the demonstration itself, an execution method chosen specifically to create maximum psychological impact. The Thornfields maintained detailed records of which execution methods produced the most effective results in terms of community compliance, treating murder as a form of applied psychology. They discovered that prolonged deaths created more lasting fear than quick ones, that public participation in the execution process made witnesses complicit in the violence, and that leaving bodies on display for specific periods maximized the demonstration effect. The family's control extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of informants and collaborators that reached into every aspect of regional life. They had contacts in law enforcement, local government, and even religious institutions, creating a surveillance system that allowed them to identify potential threats before they could organize effective resistance. This intelligence network was supported by a carefully maintained reputation for supernatural abilities, with the Thornfields encouraging rumors that they could predict their enemies' actions and appear anywhere without warning. Federal investigators who studied Thornfield territory in the 1920s found evidence of at least 63 documented executions, though the actual number was likely much higher. What made these killings particularly chilling was their systematic nature. The Thornfields didn't kill in passion or even in response to immediate threats. They killed according to carefully planned schedules designed to maintain optimal levels of fear within their territory while avoiding the kind of mass casualties that might trigger federal intervention. The family's most innovative contribution to organized violence was their development of what they called inherited punishment. When someone committed a crime against Thornfield interests but couldn't be immediately captured, the family would execute a relative instead, preferably someone with children who would grow up understanding that the Thornfield debt had been passed to them. This system created multi-generational cycles of fear that persisted long after the original crimes had been forgotten. The Vance Shadow Network operated throughout the Cumberland Gap region, establishing what federal investigators would later recognize as one of America's first organized crime syndicates. Unlike other mountain families who relied primarily on violence and intimidation, the Vances understood that lasting power required economic control, political influence, and most importantly, the ability to remain invisible while orchestrating events from behind the scenes. The family's founder, Jeremiah Vance, was a former government accountant who had fled Washington, D.C. in 1871 after being accused of embezzling federal funds intended for reconstruction projects. When he arrived in the mountains, Jeremiah brought with him not just stolen money, but an intimate knowledge of how government bureaucracy worked and how it could be manipulated. He recognized that the chaos of Reconstruction had created opportunities for those smart enough to exploit the confusion. The Vance approach to power was fundamentally different from other mountain families. Rather than establishing a visible presence and ruling through fear, they remained in the shadows, using their resources to corrupt officials, manipulate markets, and eliminate competitors through methods that appeared accidental or coincidental. They understood that the most effective criminals were those who were never suspected of being criminals at all. The family's signature practice was what they called invisible influence. Instead of directly confronting their enemies, the Vances would study their targets for months, identifying vulnerabilities in their personal lives, business relationships, and legal situations. They would then orchestrate a series of seemingly unrelated events that would destroy their targets without leaving any evidence of Vance involvement. A rival businessman might lose his financing due to rumors about his creditworthiness, suffer a fire that destroyed his inventory, and discover that key employees had been offered better positions elsewhere, all within the span of weeks. What made the Vances particularly dangerous was their patience. They were willing to spend years positioning themselves to achieve their objectives, understanding that quick actions often left evidence, while slow manipulation was virtually undetectable. They would plant information, spread rumors, and create situations that would eventually lead to their desired outcomes, often without their targets ever realizing they were under attack. The family maintained their operations through a network of legitimate businesses that provided both cover for their activities and income to fund their expansion. They owned banks, shipping companies, and manufacturing facilities throughout the region, using these enterprises to gather intelligence about their competitors and to launder money from their illegal activities. This business empire was managed by family members who appeared to be ordinary entrepreneurs, making it virtually impossible for law enforcement to connect them to criminal activities. The Vances' most sophisticated innovation was their development of what they called systemic corruption. Rather than simply bribing individual officials, they would identify promising young politicians and businessmen early in their careers and provide them with opportunities, funding, and support that would help them rise to positions of influence. These individuals would often have no idea they were being manipulated, believing their success was due to their own abilities while actually serving Vance interests without realizing it. Federal investigators who attempted to study the Vance network found themselves frustrated by the family's ability to anticipate and counter their efforts. Witnesses would suddenly become reluctant to testify, evidence would disappear from secure locations, and investigators would find themselves transferred to other cases or reassigned to different regions. The Vances had created a system of influence so comprehensive that they could neutralize threats through official channels while maintaining complete deniability. The family's control extended into the highest levels of state and federal government, with several prominent politicians later discovered to have received significant financial support from Vance-controlled entities early in their careers. This network of obligation and mutual benefit allowed the family to operate with virtual impunity for over 6 decades, making them one of the most successful criminal organizations in American history. The Saxon bone merchants established their criminal enterprise in the remote mountains of western North Carolina, where they developed what federal investigators would later describe as the most systematically profitable approach to murder in documented criminal history. Unlike other families who killed for territory, revenge, or psychological gratification, the Saxons approached murder as a business opportunity, creating a comprehensive system for converting human victims into marketable commodities. The family's operations were founded on the medical knowledge of Dr. Elias Saxon, a former anatomy professor who had been expelled from university after being caught conducting unauthorized experiments on living subjects. When he fled to the mountains in 1879, Dr. Saxon brought with him an extensive understanding of human anatomy and access to a network of medical schools, research facilities, and private collectors who were willing to pay premium prices for high-quality specimens without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins. Dr. Saxon recognized that the human body contained numerous components with commercial value in the expanding medical and scientific communities of the late 19th century. Skeletons could be sold to medical schools for anatomical instruction, organs could be preserved and sold to researchers studying disease, and even hair and teeth had markets among collectors of medical curiosities. The challenge was developing efficient methods for acquiring, processing, and distributing these products while avoiding detection by law enforcement. The Saxon compound was designed as a comprehensive processing facility where murdered victims could be systematically converted into saleable products. The family constructed specialized buildings for different stages of their operation: slaughterhouses where victims were killed and initially processed, preservation laboratories where organs and tissues were prepared for shipment, and storage facilities where finished products were maintained until they could be distributed to buyers. The family's signature innovation was their development of what they called complete utilization, a process where every part of a victim's body was put to some commercial use. Nothing was wasted in the Saxon operation. Even blood was collected and sold to medical facilities for research purposes. They maintained detailed accounting records of their activities, treating murder like any other business enterprise with profit margins, inventory management, and customer relationships. The Saxons operated through a network of traveling salesmen who transported their products to buyers in major cities throughout the eastern United States. These salesmen, often family members or trusted associates, would deliver carefully packaged specimens to medical schools, private collectors, and research facilities. The buyers rarely asked questions about the origins of these materials, creating a market that sustained the family's operations for decades. What made the Saxon operation particularly efficient was their systematic approach to victim selection. They didn't kill randomly, but carefully chose individuals whose disappearance would cause minimal investigation. Traveling merchants, drifters, and people with no local connections were preferred targets. The family maintained detailed files on potential victims, studying their routines and relationships before making their move. The Saxon business model proved so successful that they eventually expanded beyond simple murder to include kidnapping for ransom, with victims who couldn't pay being processed for their commercial value. They also developed a sideline in blackmail, using their knowledge of anatomy to stage accidents that would eliminate inconvenient witnesses while providing additional inventory for their medical supply business. The family's operations remained hidden for nearly 4 decades through a combination of careful planning, strategic bribery, and the simple fact that their victims were chosen specifically because they wouldn't be missed. When people disappeared from Saxon territory, there were simply no conventional clues for investigators to follow, no crime scenes to examine, and no physical evidence to analyze. The Kilbourne flesh traders represented the most psychologically disturbing of the deadly mountain families, operating from a series of interconnected compounds scattered throughout the border regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Led by the charismatic but deeply unstable Solomon Kilbourne, this clan combined traditional mountain violence with what federal investigators would later classify as the first documented case of organized cannibalism in American criminal history. Solomon Kilburn was a former military surgeon who had served in the Civil War, where he had developed what he described as a scientific interest in human anatomy and nutrition. His medical journals, recovered after his disappearance in 1897, contained detailed observations about the nutritional value of different human organs and tissues, complete with recipes and preparation methods that suggested extensive experimentation with human flesh as a dietary supplement. The Kilburn family's practices began during the harsh winter of 1882, when food shortages in their isolated mountain territory forced them to make what Solomon described as necessary dietary adjustments. Rather than seeking outside assistance or relocating to areas with better access to conventional food sources, the family chose to supplement their diet with what Solomon euphemistically called alternative protein sources obtained from travelers and neighbors who ventured too close to their territory. What distinguished the Kilburns from other violent families was their scientific approach to their disturbing dietary practices. Solomon maintained detailed records of his experiments with human flesh, documenting which preparation methods produced the most palatable results and which body parts provided the most nutritional value. These weren't the actions of desperate people driven to cannibalism by starvation, but the systematic activities of individuals who had chosen to view other humans as livestock. The family's signature practice was what they called selective harvesting, a process where victims would be kept alive for extended periods while the Kilburns systematically removed non-essential body parts for consumption. Solomon's medical knowledge allowed him to perform these amputations in ways that kept victims alive for weeks or months, providing fresh meat while prolonging the psychological torture of the harvesting process. The Kilburn compounds were designed to use script generation exceeded the maximum token limit. You may need to decrease the amount of reference videos in your style and try again. The mountain shadows stretched long across blood-soaked valleys in the winter of 1891, when federal investigators made a discovery that would haunt law enforcement for generations. Hidden in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, they uncovered evidence of systematic brutality so methodical, so calculating, that it challenged everything they thought they knew about organized crime in America. These weren't random acts of mountain violence or simple feuding families. These were criminal dynasties that had evolved beyond anything documented in the civilized world. What they found buried in shallow graves, carved into cave walls, and documented in journals written in languages that scholars couldn't identify, revealed four families whose methods of control went far beyond conventional understanding. These clans had developed techniques of psychological warfare, biological manipulation, and spiritual coercion that made traditional organized crime look primitive by comparison. The federal reports were immediately classified, the investigators reassigned to distant territories, and the evidence sealed in vaults that officially don't exist. But the mountain folk remember. They pass down warnings in whispered conversations, mark certain territories as forbidden ground, and cross themselves when certain names are spoken after dark. Because these four families didn't just commit crimes. They rewrote the fundamental rules of what it means to be human. The Carver blood dynasty represented the pinnacle of systematic violence in 19th century America, a family that transformed murder from a crime of passion into a precise science. Operating from their fortress-like compound in the remote mountains of eastern Tennessee, the Carvers didn't simply kill their enemies. They studied them, cataloged them, and turned their deaths into educational experiences for future generations of killers. The dynasty began with Dr. Matthias Carver, a former military surgeon who had served in the Mexican-American War, where he had developed what he called an academic interest in the cessation of life. His battlefield experience had taught him that death was merely a biological process that could be refined, perfected, and ultimately controlled. When he returned to civilian life, Dr. Carver brought with him a collection of medical instruments and an extensive library of anatomical texts that would become the foundation of his family's gruesome legacy. The Carver compound was designed as both a fortress and a laboratory, with specialized rooms for different aspects of their operations. The main house contained a fully equipped surgical theater where Dr. Carver conducted what he called termination studies, systematic experiments designed to document the exact moment when life departed from the human body. Adjacent buildings housed preservation laboratories where organs and tissues were prepared for study, and extensive libraries where the family maintained detailed records of their research. What distinguished the Carvers from other violent mountain families was their scientific approach to killing. They maintained detailed case files on every victim, documenting not just the method of death, but the psychological state of the victim beforehand, their physical responses during the killing process, and the precise moment when consciousness departed. These weren't random murders, but carefully planned experiments designed to advance what Dr. Carver called the science of human termination. The family's signature practice was called graduated elimination, a process where victims would be subjected to increasingly severe forms of torture over periods of weeks or months. Each stage was carefully monitored and documented, with the Carvers recording which techniques produced the most fear, the loudest screams, and the most complete psychological breakdown. They treated human suffering like any other scientific phenomenon, approaching it with the cold objectivity of researchers studying laboratory specimens. Dr. Carver's children were raised in this environment of systematic cruelty, educated from birth to view other human beings as nothing more than subjects for experimentation. By adolescence, each Carver child was expected to conduct their own termination studies, documenting their findings in the family's extensive archives. This multi-generational approach to murder created a dynasty of killers whose collective knowledge of human suffering exceeded anything previously documented in criminal history. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of associates and collaborators who shared their interest in what Dr. Carver called applied thanatology. They established connections with corrupt medical professionals, unscrupulous researchers, and wealthy collectors who were willing to pay premium prices for detailed documentation of human death. This network provided both financial support and intellectual validation for their activities, creating a shadow economy built on systematic murder. The Carvers' most disturbing innovation was their development of what they called inheritance protocols, methods for passing their specialized knowledge to future generations. They created detailed manuals documenting their techniques, established training programs for family members, and even developed standardized procedures for acquiring and processing victims. This systematic approach to preserving and transmitting knowledge of murder ensured that their methods would survive long after the original practitioners had died. Local law enforcement was completely unprepared to investigate crimes of this sophistication. The carvers left no conventional evidence behind, having perfected methods of body disposal that eliminated all traces of their victims. When people disappeared from carver territory, there were simply no crime scenes to examine, no physical evidence to analyze, and no witnesses willing to testify. The family had created such an effective system of concealment that their true scope of operations remained unknown even to federal investigators. The dynasty finally ended in 1923 when a massive fire consumed the Carver compound, apparently started by a kerosene lamp that had been left burning in the surgical theater. When investigators examined the ruins, they found evidence of at least 200 murders, including detailed documentation of experimental procedures that revealed the true scope of the family's activities. The journals and research notes recovered from the site were so disturbing that they were immediately classified by federal authorities and have never been released to the public. The Morton shadow cult emerged from the post-Civil War chaos as perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated criminal organization in American history. Led by the enigmatic Solomon Morton, a former Confederate intelligence officer who had specialized in psychological operations during the war, this family didn't rely on physical violence alone. They developed techniques of mental manipulation and spiritual coercion that could destroy their enemies' sanity before destroying their bodies. Solomon Morton had spent the war years studying what he called the architecture of consciousness, developing methods for breaking down human personality and rebuilding it according to his specifications. His military service had taught him that the human mind was far more fragile than most people realized, and that with the right combination of psychological pressure and spiritual manipulation, virtually anyone could be reduced to a state of complete mental submission. The Morton compound was designed as a maze of interconnected buildings, underground tunnels, and hidden chambers that served as a comprehensive facility for psychological experimentation. The architecture itself was part of their methodology, with rooms designed to induce specific mental states through the manipulation of light, sound, and spatial relationships. Victims brought to the compound would find themselves in an environment specifically designed to accelerate their psychological deterioration. The family's signature practice was called consciousness harvesting, a complex process where victims would be subjected to a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological torture designed to fragment their personalities and extract what the Mortons called spiritual essence. This wasn't simple mental abuse, but a sophisticated program of manipulation that combined elements of hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and what would later be recognized as advanced brainwashing techniques. The Morton approach to psychological manipulation was based on Solomon's theory that human consciousness could be divided into distinct components that could be isolated, studied, and ultimately extracted. He believed that by systematically breaking down a victim's sense of identity, memory, and self-awareness, he could access what he called the pure essence of human experience. This essence could then be transferred to other individuals, creating what amounted to a form of psychological cannibalism. The family maintained detailed records of their psychological experiments, documenting which techniques were most effective at inducing specific forms of mental breakdown. They developed standardized procedures for destroying memory, eliminating personality, and creating what they called consciousness vessels, individuals whose original personalities had been completely erased and replaced with programmed responses designed to serve Morton interests. What made the Mortons particularly dangerous was their ability to operate in plain sight while conducting their psychological experiments. They presented themselves as a religious community, complete with the elaborate theology that justified their activities as spiritual purification. Local residents who interacted with them found them to be charming, intelligent, and deeply spiritual people who seemed genuinely concerned with helping others achieve enlightenment. The Morton theology was a sophisticated blend of Christian imagery, occult symbolism, and pseudo-scientific theory that provided a framework for their psychological experiments. They taught that human consciousness was trapped in physical bodies that prevented spiritual evolution, and that their techniques could liberate the soul from these earthly constraints. This religious facade allowed them to attract willing participants who genuinely believed they were undergoing spiritual transformation rather than psychological destruction. The family's influence extended throughout the region through a network of converts and collaborators who had undergone their consciousness harvesting procedures. These individuals appeared to function normally in society, but were actually operating under Morton programming that compelled them to serve family interests. They provided intelligence about potential victims, facilitated kidnappings, and helped cover up evidence of the family's activities. The Morton legacy extended far beyond their immediate operations through the psychological techniques they developed. Their methods of mental manipulation were studied and refined by intelligence agencies during both world wars, becoming foundational research for modern interrogation and mind control programs. The combination of psychological pressure, spiritual manipulation, and systematic personality destruction they pioneered became standard practice for organizations seeking to control human behavior. The cult finally dissolved in 1897 when Solomon Morton disappeared during what followers called the final transcendence. According to witnesses, he had achieved such complete mastery over consciousness that he no longer required physical form. More likely, he had become the victim of his own experiments, his personality so fragmented by years of psychological manipulation that he could no longer maintain a coherent sense of identity. The Whitmore Plague Bringers established their criminal empire through the deliberate cultivation and distribution of disease, making them perhaps the most insidiously dangerous family in Appalachian history. Led by Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, a former physician who had been expelled from medical practice for conducting unauthorized experiments on patients, this clan weaponized illness itself, creating epidemics that served their political and economic interests. Dr. Whitmore's medical background had given him extensive knowledge of infectious diseases and their transmission patterns. During his legitimate practice, he had become fascinated with what he called the social dynamics of illness, studying how disease outbreaks affected community relationships, economic systems, and political structures. When his unethical experiments were discovered and he was forced to flee civilization, Whitmore applied this knowledge to creating what amounted to biological warfare campaigns against his enemies. The Whitmore compound was designed as a comprehensive facility for cultivating, preserving, and distributing pathogenic organisms. They maintained specialized laboratories where diseases were studied and refined, isolation chambers where infected victims were kept for observation, and distribution networks that allowed them to introduce specific illnesses into targeted communities. This wasn't simple poisoning, but systematic biological warfare conducted with scientific precision. The family's signature practice was called selective cultivation, a process where they would deliberately infect individuals with specific diseases and then study the progression of illness through different populations. They maintained detailed records of how various pathogens affected people of different ages, backgrounds, and physical conditions, treating human suffering as data for their biological warfare research. What made the Whitmores particularly insidious was their ability to create diseases that appeared to be natural outbreaks while actually being carefully orchestrated attacks. They would introduce pathogens into water supplies, contaminate food sources, or use infected individuals as unwitting carriers to spread illness throughout communities they wanted to control or eliminate. Their biological attacks were so sophisticated that they were rarely suspected of being deliberate acts of warfare. The family's most disturbing innovation was their development of what they called social pathogens, diseases that were designed not just to kill, but to create specific social and economic effects. They could engineer outbreaks that would primarily affect political leaders, eliminate business competitors, or create enough chaos to allow them to seize control of valuable resources. Disease became their primary tool for reshaping society according to their preferences. Dr. Whitmore's children were trained from birth in the cultivation and weaponization of disease. They learned to identify symptoms, track transmission patterns, and develop new strains of existing pathogens that would be more virulent or harder to treat. This multi-generational approach to biological warfare created a dynasty of disease specialists whose collective knowledge exceeded that of most legitimate medical institutions. The family maintained their operations through a network of corrupt medical professionals, unscrupulous researchers, and desperate individuals who were willing to serve as carriers for their biological weapons. They had contacts in hospitals, sanatoriums, and public health departments that provided them with access to infected patients and allowed them to monitor the effects of their attacks on targeted populations. The Whitmores' influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through the diseases they deliberately spread throughout the Appalachian region. Communities that crossed their interests would suddenly experience mysterious outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, or other deadly illnesses that would devastate local populations while leaving Whitmore allies mysteriously unaffected. These attacks were so subtle that they were rarely recognized as deliberate acts of warfare. The family's operations were finally exposed in 1889 when a courageous doctor in eastern Kentucky noticed unusual patterns in disease outbreaks that suggested deliberate contamination. His investigation led to the discovery of Whitmore facilities and evidence of their biological warfare activities. However, by the time federal authorities arrived to investigate, the family had disappeared, leaving behind only empty laboratories and destroyed research materials. The Blackthorn flesh merchants represented the most economically sophisticated criminal organization in Appalachian history, a family that transformed human trafficking into a comprehensive business enterprise that generated enormous profits while providing plausible deniability for their activities. Led by the ruthlessly intelligent Marcus Blackthorn, This clan didn't simply kidnap and sell people. They created an entire infrastructure for the systematic exploitation of human beings. Marcus Blackthorne was a former slave trader who had operated in the Caribbean before the Civil War, where he had developed extensive knowledge of human trafficking networks and the international markets for human cargo. When the war ended and slavery was officially abolished, Blackthorne recognized that demand for forced labor would continue to exist in forms that were less obvious but equally profitable. He established his operations in the remote mountains of western North Carolina, where he could operate beyond the reach of federal law enforcement. The Blackthorne enterprise was designed as a vertically integrated business that controlled every aspect of the human trafficking process. They maintained kidnapping operations that acquired victims from throughout the eastern United States, processing facilities where captives were prepared for sale, and distribution networks that delivered human cargo to buyers across the Americas. This comprehensive approach allowed them to maximize profits while minimizing risk. The family's signature innovation was their development of what they called product customization, a process where victims were systematically modify, error, script generation exceeded the maximum token limit. You may need to decrease the amount of reference videos in your style and try again. Blood remembers what law enforcement refuses to acknowledge. In the mist-shrouded hollers of Appalachia, where shadows stretch longer than memory and silence carries the weight of generations, certain family names invoke terror that transcends folklore. These aren't legends born of campfire tales or mountain superstition. These are documented cases of systematic brutality so methodical, so calculating, that federal investigators would classify them as America's first organized serial killing operations. The evidence exists in sealed government files, in testimonies that witnesses didn't live long enough to complete, and in medical records that defy scientific explanation. 4 families whose criminal enterprises operated with such precision that they created their own territories within the United States, regions where federal law held no authority, and where human life was measured not in years, but in the value it could provide to their twisted enterprises. What separates these families from other Appalachian criminal dynasties isn't just the scope of their violence, but the evolution of their methods. They didn't simply kill for territory or revenge. They transformed murder into an art form, developed psychological warfare techniques that wouldn't be officially recognized until decades later, and created business models based on human suffering that generated profits beyond anything conventional organized crime could achieve. The federal government has opened and immediately classified 17 separate investigations into these families since 1923. Every lead investigator has either died under mysterious circumstances, suffered complete mental breakdowns, or simply vanished without a trace. The few surviving reports, obtained through sources that officially don't exist, reveal criminal operations so sophisticated that they challenge our fundamental understanding of what human beings are capable of inflicting upon each other. These 4 families represent the darkest evolution of American organized crime, criminal dynasties that operated beyond the boundaries of conventional law enforcement and created their own kingdoms built on systematic terror. Their methods were so advanced, their psychological understanding so profound, that modern criminal organizations still study their techniques over a century after their mysterious disappearance. The Grimwald specimen collectors, established their base of operations in the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky, where they developed what federal investigators would later classify as the most methodically profitable murder operation in documented American history. Unlike other families who killed for passion, territory, or psychological gratification, the Grimwalds approached human death as both a scientific endeavor and a comprehensive business enterprise. The dynasty began with Dr. Heinrich Grimwald, a former anatomy professor who had been expelled from Johns Hopkins University in 1878 after being discovered conducting unauthorized experiments on living patients. When he fled to the mountains, Dr. Grimwald brought with him not just extensive medical knowledge, but a network of corrupt contacts throughout the academic and medical communities of the eastern United States who were willing to pay premium prices for anatomical specimens without asking uncomfortable questions about their origins. Dr. Grimwald recognized that every component of the human body possessed commercial value in the rapidly expanding medical and scientific communities of the late 19th century. Skeletons could be sold to medical schools for anatomical instruction. Organs could be preserved and sold to researchers studying disease progression. Blood could be collected for early transfusion experiments. And even hair and teeth had thriving markets among collectors of medical curiosities and practitioners of emerging forensic sciences. The Grimwald compound was designed as a comprehensive processing facility where murder victims were systematically converted into marketable commodities. They constructed specialized buildings for different stages of their operation. Acquisition chambers where victims were held and studied before processing, surgical theaters equipped with the finest medical instruments available, preservation laboratories where organs and tissues were prepared using techniques that surpassed those employed by legitimate medical facilities, and storage areas where finished products were maintained under optimal conditions until distribution. The family's signature innovation was their development of what they called complete utilization, a systematic process where every component of a victim's body was converted into some form of commercial product. Nothing was wasted in the Grimwald operation. Blood was collected and sold to early medical researchers. Bones were cleaned and articulated for educational purposes. Organs were preserved using proprietary techniques that kept them viable for extended periods, and even fingernails and hair were collected for emerging forensic studies. The Grimwalds operated through an extensive network of traveling distributors who transported their products to buyers throughout the eastern United States and Europe. These distributors, often family members or associates educated in basic medical terminology, would deliver carefully packaged specimens to medical schools, private collectors, research facilities, and teaching hospitals. The buyers rarely questioned the origins of these materials, creating a market that sustained the family's operations for over 4 decades. What made the Grimwald operation particularly efficient was their systematic approach to victim acquisition. They maintained detailed databases of potential targets, studying travel patterns, family connections, and social networks to identify individuals whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation. Traveling merchants, recent immigrants, drifters, and people with no established local connections were preferred subjects. The family employed scouts throughout multiple states who would identify suitable candidates and relay information through coded telegraph messages. The processing procedures developed by the Grimwalds represented advances in anatomical preservation that were decades ahead of legitimate medical science. They had developed chemical treatments that could preserve organs indefinitely, articulation techniques that created skeleton assemblies of unprecedented durability, and documentation methods that provided detailed anatomical information with each specimen. Their products were so superior to those available through legitimate channels that they commanded premium prices and established long-term contractual relationships with major medical institutions. The family's operations expanded beyond simple murder and processing to include kidnapping for ransom, with victims who couldn't pay being processed for their commercial value. They also developed sophisticated blackmail schemes, using their anatomical expertise to stage accidents that would eliminate inconvenient witnesses while providing additional inventory for their medical supply business. By the 1890s, the Grimwalds were operating what amounted to a criminal corporation with divisions specializing in acquisition, processing, distribution, and financial management. Federal investigators who attempted to study the Grimwald enterprise found themselves confronting an organization whose record-keeping rivaled that of major legitimate businesses. The family maintained detailed accounting ledgers documenting revenues, expenses, and profit margins for their various product lines. They had developed standardized pricing structures, quality control procedures, and customer service protocols that ensured repeat business from their criminal clients. The Grimwald legacy extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities through the anatomical specimens they provided to medical schools and research institutions. Generations of doctors and medical researchers were trained using materials obtained through the family's systematic murder operations, though they remained unaware of the true origins of their educational resources. This hidden influence on American medical education created a foundation of knowledge built quite literally on the systematic destruction of human life. The dynasty finally ended in 1921 when a massive explosion destroyed the main Grimwald compound, apparently caused by the accidental mixing of preservation chemicals in their laboratory. Federal investigators who examined the ruins found evidence of at least 300 murders, including detailed documentation of processing procedures that revealed the true scope of the family's activities. The records and specimen catalogs recovered from the site were so disturbing that they were immediately classified and have never been released to the public. The Ashwood Mind Breakers emerged from the chaos of Reconstruction as perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated criminal organization in American history. Operating throughout the border regions of Virginia and West Virginia, this family didn't rely primarily on physical violence. Instead, they developed techniques of psychological manipulation and mental torture that could destroy their victims' sanity before destroying their bodies, creating a reign of terror based not on fear of death, but on fear of losing one's mind. The family's operations were founded on the expertise of Dr. Cornelius Ashwood, a former asylum administrator who had fled Philadelphia in 1869 after being accused of conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on patients. Dr. Ashwood had spent decades studying what he called the architecture of human consciousness, developing methods for systematically breaking down personality structures and rebuilding them according to his specifications. When he established his criminal empire in the mountains, he brought with him techniques for mental manipulation that were decades ahead of legitimate psychiatric practice. The Ashwood compound was designed as a comprehensive facility for psychological experimentation and mental torture. The architecture itself was part of their methodology, with buildings designed to induce specific psychological states through manipulation of light, sound, spatial relationships, and environmental factors. Victims brought to the facility would find themselves in environments specifically engineered to accelerate psychological deterioration and increase susceptibility to mental manipulation. The family's signature practice was called consciousness harvesting, a complex process where victims were subjected to carefully orchestrated campaigns of psychological torture designed to fragment their personalities and extract what the Ashwoods called spiritual essence. This wasn't simple mental abuse, but a sophisticated program that combined elements of sensory deprivation, hypnosis, chemical manipulation, and techniques that wouldn't be officially recognized as brainwashing until decades later. Dr. Ashwood's approach to psychological manipulation was based on his theory that human consciousness could be divided into distinct components that could be isolated, studied, and ultimately extracted or transferred. He believed that by systematically breaking down a victim's sense of identity, memory, and self-awareness, he could access what he called the pure essence of human experience. This essence could then be preserved, studied, or theoretically transferred to other individuals, creating what amounted to a form of psychological vampirism. The family maintained exhaustive records of their psychological experiments, documenting which techniques were most effective at inducing specific forms of mental breakdown. They developed standardized procedures for destroying memory, eliminating personality, and creating what they called consciousness vessels, individuals whose original personalities had been completely erased and replaced with programmed responses designed to serve Ashwood interests. These human shells could function in society while being completely controlled by psychological triggers implanted during their processing. What made the Ashwoods particularly dangerous was their ability to operate in plain sight while conducting their psychological experiments. They presented themselves as a progressive medical community, complete with an elaborate therapeutic philosophy that justified their activities as advanced psychiatric treatment. Local residents who interacted with them found them to be charming, intelligent, and deeply committed to helping people achieve mental wellness and psychological breakthrough. The Ashwood therapeutic philosophy was a sophisticated blend of legitimate psychiatric theory, experimental psychology, and pseudoscientific concepts that provided a framework for their psychological experiments. They established satellite clinics throughout the region, offering treatment for depression, anxiety, and various mental ailments that were poorly understood by conventional medicine of the era. Patients who sought their help were gradually drawn into increasingly intensive treatment programs that served as cover for systematic psychological destruction. The family's influence extended throughout the region through a network of former patients and collaborators who had undergone their consciousness harvesting procedures. These individuals appeared to function normally in society, but were actually operating under Ashwood programming that compelled them to serve family interests. They provided intelligence about potential victims, facilitated kidnappings, helped cover up evidence of the family's activities, and served as unwitting agents in various criminal enterprises. The most disturbing aspect of the Ashwood operation was their development of what they called inherited programming, techniques for passing psychological control from one generation to the next. Children born to consciousness vessels would be subtly programmed from birth through environmental manipulation, targeted educational experiences, and carefully administered psychological conditioning. This multi generational approach to mind control created bloodlines of individuals who served Ashwood interests across decades without understanding their true role. The Ashwood legacy extended far beyond their immediate criminal operations through the psychological techniques they pioneered. Their methods of mental manipulation were secretly studied and refined by intelligence agencies during both world wars, becoming foundational research for military interrogation programs and early experiments in mind control. The combination of psychological pressure, environmental manipulation, and systematic personality destruction they developed became standard practice for organizations seeking to control human behavior. The family's influence on legitimate psychology was equally profound, though hidden from official acknowledgement. Several prominent psychiatrists and psychologists of the early 20th century had studied Ashwood techniques, incorporating their methods into mainstream therapeutic practice without revealing their criminal origins. This hidden influence shaped the development of American psychology in ways that created lasting ethical complications for the field. The Ashwood enterprise finally collapsed in 1924 when Dr. Cornelius disappeared during what family records described as the final transcendence. According to witnesses, he had achieved such complete mastery over consciousness that he no longer required physical form to maintain his existence. More likely, he had become the victim of his own experiments, his personality so fragmented by decades of psychological manipulation that he could no longer maintain a coherent sense of identity. The Blackthorn flesh markets represented the most economically sophisticated criminal organization in Appalachian history, a family that transformed human trafficking into a comprehensive business enterprise generating enormous profits while maintaining plausible deniability for their activities. Led by Marcus Blackthorn, a former international slave trader, this clan didn't simply kidnap and sell people. They created an entire infrastructure for the systematic commodification of human beings. Marcus Blackthorn had operated slave trading networks throughout the Caribbean and South America before the Civil War, where he had developed extensive knowledge of international human trafficking routes and the global markets for forced labor. When the war ended and slavery was officially abolished, Blackthorn recognized that demand for forced labor would continue to exist in forms that were less obvious but equally profitable. He established his operations in the remote mountains of western North Carolina, where he could develop new methodologies beyond the reach of federal law enforcement. The Blackthorn enterprise was designed as a vertically integrated business that controlled every aspect of the human trafficking process. They maintained acquisition operations that kidnapped victims from throughout the eastern United States, processing facilities where captives were prepared for various markets, training centers where individuals were conditioned for specific roles, and distribution networks that delivered human cargo to buyers across the Americas and beyond. The family's signature innovation was their development of product customization, a systematic process where victims were modified to meet specific market demands. This involved not just basic conditioning and training, but physical alterations, psychological programming, and specialized education designed to increase the commercial value of their human commodities. The Blackthorns understood that different markets required different types of human products, and they developed the capability to modify individuals to meet virtually any specification. Their most profitable market was what they called premium placement, where attractive and intelligent individuals were extensively trained and conditioned before being sold to wealthy buyers as household staff, companions, or specialized servants. This process could take months or years, during which victims were subjected to comprehensive education, psychological conditioning, and behavioral modification designed to create the perfect human commodity for discerning customers. The Blackthorns also supplied labor markets with conditioned workers who had been psychologically programmed to accept dangerous or unpleasant working conditions without complaint. These individuals were sold to mining operations, industrial facilities, and agricultural enterprises where their modified psychological state made them ideal for hazardous work that conventional employees would refuse. The conditioning process eliminated normal self-preservation instincts while maintaining work capabilities and basic intelligence. Perhaps their most disturbing market was what they euphemistically called experimental placement, where victims were sold to wealthy individuals or organizations seeking human subjects for various forms of research or entertainment. Error. Script generation exceeded the maximum token limit. You may need to decrease the amount of reference videos in your style and try again. Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Tennessee, where federal marshals once disappeared without a trace, and entire communities learned to whisper certain names only after dark, the Redmond flesh merchants established their criminal empire on a foundation of systematic brutality that would make their predecessors look like amateurs. Operating from a network of fortified compounds scattered across the remote wilderness, this family didn't simply engage in violence for territory or revenge. They transformed human suffering into a comprehensive business enterprise that generated profits beyond anything conventional organized crime could achieve. The dynasty began with Captain Marcus Redmond, a former Confederate intelligence officer who had specialized in what military historians would later classify as psychological warfare operations. When the war ended, Marcus recognized that the chaos of Reconstruction had created unprecedented opportunities for those willing to exploit human desperation. He established his base of operations in a valley so remote that it appears on no government maps, where 3 state boundaries converge in a confusion of jurisdictional authority that he would exploit with ruthless efficiency. The Redmond enterprise was designed as a vertically integrated operation that controlled every aspect of what they euphemistically called human resource management. They maintained acquisition divisions that identified and captured suitable subjects, processing facilities where individuals were prepared for specific markets, training centers where victims were conditioned for particular roles, and distribution networks that delivered human commodities to buyers throughout the Americas and beyond. What distinguished the Redmonds from other criminal families wasn't just the scope of their operations, but their systematic approach to product customization. They understood that different markets required different types of human products, and they developed the capability to modify individuals to meet virtually any specification. This involved not just basic conditioning and training, but physical alterations, psychological programming, and specialized education designed to increase the commercial value of their human inventory. The family's signature innovation was their development of what they called selective enhancement, a process where victims were systematically modified to meet specific buyer requirements. Attractive and intelligent individuals were extensively trained and psychologically conditioned before being sold to wealthy buyers as household staff, companions, or specialized servants. This process could take months or years, during which subjects were held in facilities designed to break down their original personalities and rebuild them according to purchaser specifications. The Redmonds also supplied labor markets with conditioned workers who had been psychologically programmed to accept dangerous or unpleasant working conditions without complaint. These individuals were sold to mining operations, industrial facilities, and agricultural enterprises where their modified psychological state made them ideal for hazardous work that conventional employees would refuse. The conditioning process eliminated normal self-preservation instincts while maintaining work capabilities and basic intelligence. Perhaps their most disturbing market segment was what they euphemistically called experimental placement, where victims were sold to wealthy individuals or organizations seeking human subjects for various forms of research. The Redmonds maintained relationships with corrupt medical professionals, unscrupulous researchers, and private collectors who were willing to pay premium prices for subjects with specific physical or psychological characteristics. The family's operations remained hidden for decades through a combination of geographic isolation, strategic corruption, and systematic elimination of potential witnesses. They had contacts in law enforcement agencies across multiple states, politicians who owed their positions to Redmond support, and business leaders who profited from their services. This network of corruption and mutual benefit allowed them to operate with virtual impunity while maintaining complete deniability for their activities. Local communities in Redmond territory lived under a reign of terror so complete that entire families would disappear overnight without anyone daring to investigate. The family maintained their control through demonstration killings, public executions designed to show the consequences of defying their authority or interfering with their operations. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated psychological warfare campaigns designed to paralyze entire communities with fear. The Redmond legacy extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities through the techniques they pioneered in human trafficking and psychological manipulation. Their methods of breaking down human personality and rebuilding it according to specifications became foundational practices for organized crime syndicates that would later emerge throughout the 20th century. Modern human trafficking organizations still study Redmond techniques, adapting their mountain strategies for urban environments. The Caldwell Mind Harvesters emerged from the post-Civil War chaos as perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated criminal organization in American history. Operating throughout the remote mountain regions of western North Carolina, this family developed techniques of mental manipulation and consciousness extraction that went far beyond simple brainwashing. They created what federal investigators would later classify as America's first documented case of systematic psychological vampirism. The family's operations were founded on the expertise of Dr. Solomon Caldwell, a former asylum administrator who had fled Boston in 1871 after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on patients. Dr. Caldwell had spent decades studying what he called the architecture of human consciousness, developing methods for systematically fragmenting personality structures and extracting what he believed were transferable components of human awareness and memory. The Caldwell compound was designed as a comprehensive facility for psychological experimentation and mental extraction. The architecture itself was part of their methodology, with buildings designed to induce specific psychological states through manipulation of light, sound, spatial relationships, and environmental factors. Victims brought to the facility would find themselves in environments specifically engineered to accelerate psychological deterioration and increase susceptibility to consciousness manipulation. The family's signature practice was called essence harvesting, a complex process where subjects were subjected to carefully orchestrated campaigns of psychological torture designed to fragment their personalities and extract what the Caldwells called spiritual essence. This wasn't simple mental abuse, but a sophisticated program that combined elements of sensory deprivation, hypnosis, chemical manipulation, and techniques that wouldn't be officially recognized as advanced psychological warfare until decades later. Dr. Caldwell's approach to consciousness manipulation was based on his theory that human awareness could be divided into distinct components that could be isolated, extracted, and theoretically transferred to other individuals. He believed that by systematically breaking down a subject's sense of identity, memory, and self-awareness, he could access and harvest the pure essence of human experience. This extracted essence could then be preserved, studied, or transferred to family members, creating what amounted to a form of psychological cannibalism. The family maintained exhaustive records of their psychological experiments, documenting which techniques were most effective at inducing specific forms of mental breakdown and consciousness fragmentation. They developed standardized procedures for destroying memory, eliminating personality, and creating what they called awareness vessels, individuals whose original consciousness had been completely extracted and replaced with programmed responses designed to serve Caldwell interests. What made the Caldwells particularly dangerous was their ability to operate in plain sight while conducting their psychological experiments. They presented themselves as a progressive medical community, complete with an elaborate therapeutic philosophy that justified their activities as advanced psychiatric treatment. Local residents who interacted with them found them to be charming, intelligent, and deeply committed to helping people achieve mental wellness and psychological breakthrough. The Caldwell therapeutic philosophy was a sophisticated blend of legitimate psychiatric theory, experimental psychology, and pseudoscientific concepts that provided a framework for their consciousness extraction experiments. They established satellite clinics throughout the region, offering treatment for depression, anxiety, and various mental ailments that were poorly understood by conventional medicine of the era. Patients who sought their help were gradually drawn into increasingly intensive treatment programs that served as cover for systematic psychological destruction and essence harvesting. The family's influence extended throughout the region through a network of former patients and collaborators who had undergone their consciousness harvesting procedures. These individuals appeared to function normally in society, but were actually operating with extracted consciousness components that had been replaced with Caldwell programming. They provided intelligence about potential subjects, facilitated acquisitions, helped cover up evidence of the family's activities, and served as unwitting agents in various criminal enterprises. The most disturbing aspect of the Caldwell operation was their development of what they called inherited consciousness, techniques for transferring extracted awareness components from one generation to the next. Family members would undergo procedures where they absorbed consciousness fragments harvested from their victims, gradually accumulating vast stores of extracted human experience. This multi-generational approach to consciousness theft created a dynasty of individuals whose awareness encompassed thousands of stolen lives and memories. The Caldwell enterprise finally collapsed in 1923 when Dr. Solomon disappeared during what family records described as the final transcendence. According to witnesses, he had achieved such complete mastery over consciousness that he had absorbed too many conflicting awareness components and could no longer maintain a coherent sense of identity. His consciousness had become a battlefield of competing personalities and memories that ultimately destroyed his ability to function as a unified individual. The Thornton Bone architects established their criminal empire in the limestone cave systems running beneath the Cumberland Plateau, where they developed what federal investigators would later describe as the most methodical approach to murder and body utilization in documented American history. Unlike other families who killed for passion, territory, or psychological gratification, the Thorntons approached death as both a scientific endeavor and a comprehensive manufacturing process. The dynasty began with Dr. Ezra Thornton, a former anatomy professor who had been expelled from medical school after being discovered conducting unauthorized experiments on living subjects. When he fled to the mountains in 1876, Dr. Thornton brought with him not just extensive medical knowledge, but a vision of transforming human death into a systematic industrial process that could generate enormous profits while advancing what he called the science of biological utilization. The Thornton compound was built around a series of natural caves that they modified into a comprehensive processing facility. They constructed specialized chambers for different stages of their operation, acquisition areas where victims were held and studied before processing, surgical theaters equipped with the finest medical instruments available, preservation laboratories where organs and tissues were prepared using techniques that surpassed those employed by legitimate medical facilities, and manufacturing areas where human remains were converted into various commercial products. The family's signature innovation was their development of what they called complete biological utilization, a systematic process where every component of a victim's body was converted into some form of valuable product. Nothing was wasted in the Thornton operation. Bones were processed into high-quality fertilizer, organs were preserved and sold to medical facilities, blood was refined into various chemical compounds, and even hair and fingernails were collected for specialized industrial applications. The Thorntons operated through an extensive network of distributors who transported their products to buyers throughout the eastern United States and Europe. These distributors, often family members or associates educated in basic chemistry and manufacturing processes, would deliver carefully processed materials to agricultural suppliers, medical institutions, chemical companies, and industrial facilities. The buyers rarely questioned the origins of these superior quality materials, creating markets that sustained the family's operations for decades. What made the Thornton operation particularly efficient was their systematic approach to victim selection and processing optimization. They maintained detailed databases of potential subjects, studying not just their availability and vulnerability, but their physical characteristics and potential commercial value. Different body types were preferred for different applications, with the family developing expertise in matching victims to their most profitable end uses. The processing procedures developed by the Thorntons represented advances in biological utilization that were decades ahead of legitimate industry. They had developed chemical treatments that could extract maximum value from human remains, processing techniques that created products of unprecedented quality and purity, and preservation methods that maintained material integrity for extended periods. Their products were so superior to those available through conventional sources that they commanded premium prices and established long-term contractual relationships with major industrial clients. The family's operations expanded beyond simple murder and processing to include what they called sustainable harvesting, where subjects were kept alive for extended periods while non-essential body parts were systematically removed for processing. Dr. Thornton's medical knowledge allowed him to perform these procedures in ways that maximized product yield while keeping subjects alive for months or years, creating a continuous production process that generated steady revenue streams. The Thornton legacy extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities through the industrial processes they pioneered in biological utilization. Their techniques for extracting commercial value from human remains influenced the development of legitimate industries, though the origins of these innovations remained hidden from public knowledge. Modern forensic science and industrial chemistry still use principles first developed in the Thornton Cave laboratories. The Maxwell shadow weavers operated throughout the border regions of Virginia and Kentucky, establishing what federal investigators would later recognize as the most sophisticated intelligence and assassination network in 19th century America. Unlike other families who relied primarily on brute force or intimidation, the Maxwells specialized in information warfare and elimination techniques that made their targets disappear without leaving any evidence of foul play. The family's founder, Colonel James Maxwell, was a former military intelligence officer who had served in various covert operations during the Civil War. His experience in espionage, counterintelligence, and psychological operations had taught him that information was more valuable than gold, and that the ability to eliminate enemies without detection was the ultimate form of power. When he established his civilian operations, Colonel Maxwell brought with him techniques for intelligence gathering and assassination that were decades ahead of conventional law enforcement capabilities. The Maxwell compound was designed as a training facility and operational headquarters for what amounted to a private intelligence agency. They maintained classrooms where family members and associates were trained in surveillance techniques, safe houses where agents could operate undercover, communication centers where information was processed and analyzed, and specialized laboratories where assassination tools and techniques were developed and refined. The family's signature practice was called shadow weaving, a comprehensive approach to intelligence gathering and target elimination that combined surveillance, psychological manipulation, and undetectable assassination methods. Maxwell operatives would spend months studying their targets, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities and developing detailed profiles of their personal and professional relationships. This intelligence would then be used to orchestrate eliminations that appeared to be accidents, suicides, or deaths from natural causes. The Maxwell's approach to assassination was based on Colonel James's philosophy that the perfect murder was one that was never recognized as murder. They developed techniques for inducing heart attacks, creating accidents that left no suspicious evidence, and driving targets to suicide through psychological manipulation. Their methods were so sophisticated that coroners rarely suspected foul play, making it virtually impossible for law enforcement to connect Maxwell operations to the deaths of their targets. The family maintained their operations through a network of agents and informants that extended throughout the eastern United States. They had contacts in government agencies, law enforcement departments, business organizations, and social institutions that provided them with intelligence about potential targets and contracts. This network also served as a distribution system for their services, connecting them with wealthy clients who needed problems eliminated discreetly. The Maxwell business model was based on providing what they called resolution services to clients who faced problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. Politicians who needed opponents eliminated, businessmen who wanted competitors removed, and wealthy individuals who sought revenge against enemies could contract Maxwell services with complete confidence that their involvement would never be discovered. The family's reputation for discretion and effectiveness made them the preferred choice for those who could afford their premium prices. The most disturbing aspect of the Maxwell operation was their development of what they called inherited contracts, assassination assignments that were passed down through generations. When a client died before their contract was complete, script generation exceeded the maximum token limit. You may need to decrease the amount of reference videos in your style and try again. These final families represent the apex of evil in Appalachian history, criminal dynasties whose methods were so sophisticated and brutal that they transcended simple mountain feuding to become something approaching corporate-level organized crime. They proved that in the vast wilderness of 19th century America, determined families could create their own kingdoms of terror and maintain them through systematic violence that would make modern cartels seem restrained by comparison. The Ferguson blood dynasty's methodical approach to serial killing created the template for organized murder that would influence criminal organizations well into the 20th century. Their systematic documentation of torture methods and their multi-generational approach to violence established patterns that law enforcement agencies still study today. The psychological techniques they developed for breaking down human consciousness became foundational research for interrogation programs and psychological warfare operations that wouldn't be officially acknowledged for decades. The Ashford Shadow Walkers pioneered psychological manipulation techniques that were decades ahead of legitimate psychiatric practice. Their methods of mental torture and consciousness extraction influenced the development of brainwashing programs during both world wars and established principles of psychological control that intelligence agencies would later adapt for covert operations. The family's ability to operate in plain sight while conducting systematic psychological destruction created a model for how criminal organizations could use legitimate facades to conceal horrific activities. The grim bone collectors transformed murder into a profitable business enterprise that generated revenue streams from every component of their victims' bodies. Their systematic approach to processing human remains and their network of distributors created a criminal supply chain that influenced how organized crime would later approach human trafficking and body disposal. The medical techniques they developed for preserving human specimens were superior to those used by legitimate institutions, making their products highly sought after in the expanding medical education market. The Harrow Night Riders demonstrated how criminal organizations could use political violence to achieve territorial control that exceeded the reach of federal authority. Their military-style organization and psychological warfare tactics created a template for domestic terrorism that would be replicated by extremist groups throughout the 20th century. Their ability to maintain popular support while conducting systematic political violence proved that criminal organizations could achieve legitimacy through ideological justification. What made these 8 families particularly dangerous wasn't just their individual methods, but their collective impact on American society. They operated during a critical period in the nation's development, when federal authority was still establishing itself in remote regions and when local law enforcement lacked the resources and coordination necessary to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises. Their success in creating autonomous territories within the United States challenged fundamental assumptions about the federal government's ability to maintain order and enforce law throughout its territory. The techniques these families developed influenced every aspect of organized crime that would emerge in 20th century America. Modern criminal organizations study their methods of territorial control, their approaches to eliminating witnesses, their techniques for corrupting officials, and their strategies for maintaining family loyalty across generations. The combination of systematic violence, economic control, and political influence they pioneered became the foundation for how organized crime syndicates would operate in urban environments. Perhaps most significantly, these families proved that geographic isolation could create criminal sanctuaries that existed completely outside the reach of conventional law enforcement. They demonstrated that determined criminal organizations could establish their own legal systems, complete with their own courts, their own methods of punishment, and their own standards of justice. This concept of criminal sovereignty would later influence the development of organized crime families who would adapt these mountain strategies to create urban territories where their authority superseded that of legitimate government. The federal government's inability to effectively combat these families revealed fundamental weaknesses in American law enforcement that would persist well into the 20th century. The jurisdictional conflicts between federal, state, and local agencies, the lack of communication between different law enforcement organizations, and the political corruption that protected these families created systemic problems that plagued efforts to combat organized crime for decades. Their legacy lives on in the remote hollows and forgotten valleys of Appalachia, where certain areas remain avoided by locals who remember the old warnings. The psychological impact of their reign of terror created cultures of silence and fear that affected entire regions, establishing patterns of resistance to outside authority that persist to this day. Communities that experienced their control developed distinctive characteristics that can still be observed: unusual rates of unsolved crimes, persistent poverty that seems to resist economic development, and social structures that prioritize loyalty over legal compliance. The descendants of these families, scattered throughout America, carry genetic and cultural markers that law enforcement agencies quietly monitor. Whether through inherited predisposition or learned behavior, certain bloodlines continue to produce individuals whose criminal activities echo the methods pioneered by their ancestors. Modern DNA analysis has allowed researchers to trace these family lines and identify patterns of behavior that suggest the influence of these criminal traditions continues across generations. What remains most chilling about these 8 families is how completely they were able to erase themselves from official history. When federal investigators finally began serious attempts to document their activities in the 1920s and 1930s, they found that most records had been destroyed, most witnesses had disappeared, and most evidence had been systematically eliminated. These families had created such effective systems of concealment that their true scope of operations remains unknown to this day. The mountains keep their secrets, wrapped in mist and protected by generations of silence. But the influence of these 8 families extends far beyond their original territories, woven into the fabric of American organized crime, like blood through stone. They created a legacy of violence and terror that continues to shape criminal enterprises more than a century after their disappearance, proving that some forms of evil are too sophisticated to die and too dangerous to forget. From the shadow-draped hollows of Appalachia, these families reached across time to influence criminal organizations that would emerge in cities thousands of miles away. Their methods became the foundation for how organized crime operates in America. Their territories became the model for criminal sanctuaries, and their legacy became a reminder that in the vast wilderness of this nation, there are still places where ancient hungers wait patiently for new opportunities to feed. The 8 deadliest Appalachian families didn't just commit crimes, they rewrote the rules of what organized crime could achieve in America. Their kingdoms of terror may have vanished into the mist, but their influence echoes through every major criminal enterprise that followed, a dark inheritance that continues to shape the underworld of American crime. These stories reveal how isolation and desperation can drive people to make bargains that echo through generations. In the shadows of America's oldest mountains, 5 families discovered that some forms of prosperity come with prices that compound over time. Whether you believe these accounts or dismiss them as folklore, the mountains themselves remain unchanged, patient, and eternal. What's certain is that in those forgotten hollows, where the mist never fully clears, the old ways of thinking about sacrifice and reward still hold power over those desperate enough to listen.